history of 1520. This is our YouTube portion, which means there'll be about 50 minutes of lecture. Probably do it in 2 sections. Usually my camera shuts off after about 20. So this should be followed up with a discussion forum on Blackboard. So I'll pose some questions. Get in there because that will be my means of taking attendance. All right. So get into this discussion board following this lecture in Blackboard and discuss the items I've given you. That's how I know you guys were present and paying attention, right? Since we're only going to meet twice a week for 100 minutes, 50 minutes, 50 minutes, and this is your other 15 minutes as required. Right now, just kind of current events. Republican National Convention's third night as unrest in Wisconsin. A young man shot 2 protesters with a semi-automatic rifle apparently last night, and a major hurricane about to hit Texas or Louisiana. So, interesting times, right? The old Chinese curse, may you live in interesting times. Well, the 15th century was also an interesting time. How's that for a segue? And that will be our topic for this lecture, chapter 22, the first real topic in our course. Well, we did historiography, that's important as well to set the stage. But now hopefully you've gotten a hold of a book, you're working through a textbook. I have in fact put chapter 22 online in a PDF, so if you didn't get the textbook yet, please, it's not pretty, but it is up there in black and white as a PDF. So, what's going on here for you folks? Let me just pull this one up. Actually, may not be your class, but in the announcements, I will put the link to Blackboard. Actually, if you're watching this video, you did get the link because I put it in the same announcement. But I also put up readings. So keep in mind that we have 4 exams through the semester. Each exam has 5 questions. 1 question per chapter, essentially. So 4 questions from the textbook and the corresponding lecture. But 1 question on current events. And so we have 1 article per week. This week, actually, how do we teach history in an age of racial awakening? Okay, which the news tonight is kind of playing into as well. All right. So how do we deal, with Confederate statues, right? Statues that honored Confederate leaders that actually were not put up during the Civil War. That would not have made sense. They would have been taken down as Union troops moved through the South. Those statues were actually put up in the early 20th century. So what did that mean? That white people put up statues honoring racists long after the Civil War. Okay, was it to honor those individuals or to say something about the desegregation, the civil rights movement, very early civil rights movement? Okay, that actually begins shortly after World War I. We always think of the 1950s and 60s, but civil rights start to become rather active civil rights movement among African Americans and their white allies after World War I. And in fact, civil rights have never died, right? There were always advocates for civil rights, but it became a larger movement really in the 1920s and 30s, long before Martin Luther King Jr., with all due respect. So, please read this article. There is some video attached to it. Make sure you watch the video so you are prepared to kind of discuss this article and the other 3 by the time we take our first exam, about a month from now. Okay, so hold on to that link. That link should not expire. Right? For tonight, we're going to look at transoceanic encounters and global connections. That's kind of a mouthful. What do they mean by that? Well, there's something rather new in historiography. Remember, we did a lesson on historiography. Recently, I said there's some new subfields within history. Disability studies, maybe the history of children. How about the history of the Atlantic? That's only a few decades old when historians, in large numbers anyway, started to say, the Atlantic has a history. It's not just blue stuff on a map. It connected people, especially after 1492, connected the peoples of Europe, Africa, North and South America. Right? So it's not just the people on boats in the water, it's the littoral or the coastal regions and how it began to create a global economy or expand a pre-existing global economy. So we call it encounters. We no longer say that Columbus discovered America, rather disrespectful to the native people and their ancestors who had been in the Western Hemisphere for at least 15, probably closer to 20,000 years. But nonetheless, Columbus does unwittingly create global connections that have never subsided. Right? The Vikings actually came across the northern Atlantic about 500 years before Columbus. It was not a permanent connection. In many ways, the Leif Erikson's voyages and those of others were largely forgotten. They might have survived in Swedish sagas, Scandinavian songs and stories, and an archaeological record in places like Newfoundland where Viking artifacts have been found, but there's no permanent connection. After Columbus, for better or worse, there has been. Since you're watching this on YouTube, I will go more quickly than I would in class because you can slow this down or rewind it, or we'll get a cup of coffee, come back, and I'll still be speaking, kind of pause it. So in the 15th century, remember that's the 1400s, right? You and I are living in 2020. That's when I'm recording this. By the way, I'm all alone in a room of no one. So from time to time, I need to go check my camera to make sure it didn't just suddenly stop on me, and I'm actually really just speaking to myself, right? So here we are in the year 2020, but we're in the 21st century, right? So the 1400s is the 15th century. That's an age where we see the rise of profound global connection. Okay? The origins, anyway, of what becomes profound global connection by our own period. It does happen within a European framework at first. That's not necessarily a good thing. In fact, it's in many ways a bad thing. But the connections become permanent, and we see not only the interaction of people across the Atlantic, but also plants, animals, and diseases, okay? With really devastating consequences for the peoples, societies of the Western Hemisphere. The Western Hemisphere is the one I'm standing in. Most of you probably are as well, all right? The Western Hemisphere, the Americas. So, early modern age. I know this class is supposed to start in 1500, but for no extra cost, you're getting 100 years extra here, right? Pushing it back to 1400 is an age of European expansion. In some ways, the Europeans had been expanding for centuries, pushing northward into the Baltic region, for example, the Crusades of the 11th and 12th centuries, pushing into the Southwest Asia, or sometimes called the Middle East. And also, especially in Iberia, which is a geographic term for Spain plus Portugal, pushing Catholic monarchs, organizing and consolidating northern Spain or the northern peninsula, and pushing non-Catholics, which in that era meant Muslims and Jews. Spain had been largely Muslim-ruled from the 8th century, okay? But by the 12th and 13th centuries, the Muslims started to be pushed ever southward. That reconquest, or reconquista, was completed in 1492. That's a really auspicious year, right? So sometimes, to remember things in history, it's okay to become the director of your own movie, okay? You're the director, you're not the star, sorry. But you can kind of imagine Ferdinand and Isabella, or Isabella and Ferdinand, kind of standing there pushing the last Moorish or Muslim ruler off the southern coast of Spain, Granada, across the Mediterranean to North Africa, and then say, well, what next? Honey? I don't know if they were really in love. I don't think so. But, what next? And then Columbus comes along. Hey, I'm back. You rejected me before, but let's keep going off the coast, except in that direction, not south. Okay, let's go west to get east. Go figure. And you can imagine Isabel like, well, why not, right? Why not Reconquista? Let's carry on this conquering drive. And the way the conquistadors acted in the Americas, pretty brutally, okay? They would kind of carry on that tradition of violence against the ethnic other. By the way, Jewish people also expelled from Spain in 1492. Okay? And to make sure they didn't come back, or if they converted, they didn't return to their Jewish or Muslim faith, or later on Protestant denomination, the Spanish government set up the Inquisition to put people on trial in case they were not Catholic. Okay? That was a state-run look, it was a terror arm to enforce conformity. Okay, let's face it. That's an age of absolutism where there was no parliament or Congress. The monarchs had all the political power. Their neighbor, Portugal, the Portuguese, Atlantic-facing people, kind of hard-scrabble, seafaring people. I've been to Portugal, love the land, love the people. But in some ways, not a tremendous amount of arable, meaning farmable land, kind of hard-scrabble soil. When I was there were olive trees and cork trees that had probably been planted during the Roman times, or at least the grandchildren of those trees. So, a cool country. but not a lot of natural resources, at least in the 15th century. So the Portuguese took to the sea. Right? They built eventually ships that could ply the rough waters of the Atlantic and fished, and gradually began to move down the coast of Africa. Those voyages were sponsored by a member of the royal family, Prince Henry the Navigator, who would essentially say, go down the coast, go out as far as you can, map it out, put a white cross on the beach or on the coastline, and then come back and tell me about it. And we'll give those plans to the next voyage. Hey, after you pass one white cross, go as far as you can and plant another cross. Hey, the next trip, go 2 crosses and plant a third. Essentially, and eventually all the way down the coast of Africa. Okay? Well, off the coast of Africa, the Portuguese kind of rediscovered islands where they realized they could plant sugar, which is a very, very, very difficult crop to plant, harvest, process, and they weren't essentially willing to do it themselves, so enslaved people from Africa were brought to these islands right off the coast, well, a couple, maybe 100 miles off the coast, and forced to plant sugar, sometimes worked to death. So we see a new form of slavery arise. There had been slavery in Africa, there had been slavery in Europe. It's fairly well known that Eastern European peoples were enslaved in such large numbers that that's where the word slave comes from, Slavic people, right, Southeastern Europe, Europeans. But not because of their ethnicity, it tended because of their poverty. Maybe they lost in a war, they're prisoners of war. Sometimes people accused of witchcraft or people convicted of a crime were enslaved. Sometimes slavery was temporary. It was not a type of chattel slavery where someone is essentially worked to death. Before they die, if they have children, those children are enslaved. The children's children are enslaved. There's a new form of slavery arises on these Portuguese islands off the coast of Africa growing sugar. And that system will essentially be cut and pasted from the Madeira Islands, the Azores, into the Americas, which your book calls the New World. I try to avoid that term, right, but into the Americas. So the Portuguese are look, they're fishing, they're moving down the coast of Africa. North Africa was well known, right? The coast of North Africa was well known, but there's that big barrier below that called the Sahara Desert that certainly very few Europeans had traversed. Okay? There was gold on the other side of the Sahara, and that gold would trickle through the Sahara through Berber Muslim merchants on camels, but very few Europeans did. But now the sea route, well, that's a lot easier than going on a camel for a couple months across the Sahara. Right? So bringing back gold, ivory, which we're going to talk about human rights, but animal rights as well. This was slaughtering elephants to get their tusks, their teeth essentially. Slavery implanted and made even worse, so there can be degrees of slavery. This becomes, for lack of a better term, really bad slavery off the coast of Africa. All right, but that's not the end game, right? The Portuguese don't just want gold, ivory, slaves, sugar. They want to get around this landmass called Africa to get to the markets of what I'll call the Middle East, right? Asia, Middle Asia, Southwest Asia, or even further afield. Well, why couldn't they go over land? They could, but it was super expensive, right? Seaborne trade is always cheaper. Floating a bunch of stuff on water is always cheaper than carrying it on carts over land, especially because there was a really powerful empire based in what is now Turkey called the Ottoman state, the Ottoman Empire. It was very, very wealthy, much wealthier than any European country at the time. And you wanted to move through the Ottoman Empire, they're going to charge you, right? They became the middlemen to trade. So the Portuguese are trying to cut them out. We'll see this on a map in a second. Finally, they make it. Vasco da Gama makes it all the way around Africa. The Cape of Storms becomes the Cape of Good Hope. All right. So da Gama, Bartholomew Diaz made it, and he had to turn around because bad winds and guess here. All right. But Vasco da Gama, he tacks a little too far, perhaps to starboard to the right, and swings around. By the time they get here, they pick up some Muslim sailors who are familiar with this side of Africa, the eastern coast of Africa, and take them to India, and a fortune is made. Like 5 boats filled with pepper, right? Pepper, all right? Spices and Christians is what da Gama wanted. And made it back and made a fortune. So the Portuguese are going to dominate this route. In addition to white crosses on the coastline, they also put, stand over here, they also put cannons, okay, facing out. So if anyone else tries to go down that coast, boom, right? They're going to blast them out of the water, even if they're Spanish. So the Spanish couldn't go down the coast of Africa, couldn't do the same thing, or they're going to get blown out of the water. So Columbus has this idea. He, of course, was an Italian. He had pitched this plan to the monarchs of France and England and Spain, and everyone said, "You're crazy." He's like, "The world is this big," when in fact it's this big. Most geographers knew that. Columbus was wrong, but he gets lucky. Okay? I suppose Isabella and Ferdinand said, "Oh, what the heck? You know, give this guy 3 ships." They also had some Italian investment money, a little complicated, and there he goes. Okay? And he discovers, in their terms, right, and in their words, he had discovered a path to Asia. That's what he thought, right? He thought he had discovered a path to Asia. So October 12, 1492, actually lands in the Caribbean, right? On an island that will be known as San Salvador. I'm not sure what the Taino people who live there called it. They did not leave us writing. And as I said last time, it's not because they were somehow inferior. I've been to that island. We think it was the island he landed on. And look, if I could retire there, I'd probably never write another thing or read anything else, right? It's like lush green and turquoise water, green palm trees and white sand, right? So the fact they didn't write didn't make them inferior. It just meant we don't have the written records we would like to have from the Taino. And in fact, we don't even have a later oral tradition that could be written down because they're going to be decimated by European disease. So Columbus actually makes 4 voyages, ends up in Cuba eventually, enslaving native peoples and doing all types of nasty things. Although, without excusing him, we need to understand that Columbus was a product of his culture, his zeitgeist. Unfortunately, he couldn't break through that zeitgeist to a higher level of morality. Hopefully you and I can, but that's tough. The Europeans, like Columbus and the Portuguese, the Europeans were followed, had the ships that could ply the Atlantic. First the caravel, there's a reproduction there. Cannons, steel swords. Native people had none of this, right? The native people did not have boats that could go across the Atlantic to Europe. They did not have metals, not because they were inferior again, right? Just it was difficult. It's difficult to make metal. They didn't have cannons. Did that make them inferior? No. Why did the Europeans have cannons? Because they seemed to be at war with one another all the time. Did that make the Europeans superior because they're always fighting one another? And they did develop pretty good weapons for the time, but it's based on violence. Native people had, look, we could be violent toward one another as well. Let's not create a binary of good versus evil here. All, people in all societies have been evil and bad, malevolent, and also good, so let's not stereotype by culture. But the Europeans certainly had the technology, the navigational knowledge, even instruments they had kind of stolen from the Chinese and from the Arabs to make it across the Atlantic and home again. Henry the Navigator, again, Portuguese royal family, had been pushing voyages down the coast of Africa to get to India, and Ferdinand and Isabella already said this, right? Columbus miscalculates the size of the Earth. Gets so lucky though, right? I mean, if the Bahamas, the Caribbean, actually it's called sometimes the Watlings Island, had not existed, he would have perished, right? It would have been nowhere to stop between Spain and China. There's too much water, you'd have no food, you'd run out of drinking water. Crew would probably have thrown him overboard, right? So he gets lucky. He creates permanent hemispheric links. So the Europeans get, gradually, an understanding of wind patterns. I'm going to check my camera. Okay, and it's just about ready to stop. So this will be part 1. Come back for part 2.